You may have stumbled upon this video because you're looking for advice on buying a knitting machine. If you're looking to do extensive research and know what you're interested in doing, this is not the video for you. I'm gonna link some of those in the description. Instead though, if you've come up upon a knitting machine on Facebook Marketplace or on Craigslist and you don't know that much about it, you've been kind of thinking about it, and you're feeling a little impulsive and maybe it's really cheap and you want to figure it out, this is the video for you. I bought my machines not knowing what I was looking at, and if I had known what I was looking for, I don't know that I would have made a different decision, but I would have been much more informed. It can be really hard to understand what you're looking at when you're staring at a box of junk in somebody's driveway. And knitting machines have a lot of parts. Similar to a sewing machine, if you're not familiar with sewing machines, a sewing machine looks really complicated, but once you're familiar with it, it's much easier to understand it. The same is true of knitting machines. So the first part that you absolutely want to make sure that you have is the needle bed. Now, if you're not buying a needle bed, you're basically buying parts and you're not buying a machine. That's the big hunk of metal here. The second and most important part that you're going to be looking for is the carriage. The carriage is what actually slides back and forth and does the knitting on the machine. The carriage might be on the machine or it might be separate. When you are looking for the carriage, there might be multiple carriages that come with a particular machine. The one you want to make sure that you have should have a tension dial on the front. The next piece that you want to look for is a sinker plate. The sinker plate attaches to the carriage and feeds the yarn across the machine. The sinker plate and carriage might be connected. Replacing the carriage could cost as much as replacing the machine itself. And a sinker plate could also cost several $100s. I would not buy a machine if you do not know that there is a carriage and a sinker plate that go with that machine. So the three things that I would be looking for 100% of the time before purchasing a machine would be the needle bed, the carriage, and the sinker plate. Everything else can be replaced. They don't make these machines really anymore, so it's not as simple as going onto the manufacturer's website to buy parts, which is why it's really important to make sure that you have those three pieces first. You will need a couple of additional things before you start knitting. The first thing is the tension rod. So that's this big piece over here, and I'll show a picture of it. The tension rod is required. This is not an optional piece. If you are a sewist and know how to sew, you might be familiar with stands for thread. It's part thread stand and part tensioning. So 100% you have to have one before you can start knitting. They cost about $35 to replace, so I wouldn't say that this is like a make it or break it piece before you purchase a machine. The next thing that you absolutely need before you start knitting are attachment bolts. These are also pretty cheap and easy to replace, less than $20. These machines are really heavy and they take a lot of momentum to get going. So it is important that they're bolted to the table, otherwise you might wind up with a lap full of machine, and like I said, they're heavy. You'll need a cast-on comb, which has these hooks on it. You'll need some weights. These are claw weights. You might see these types of weights. They have a hook on them. While it's not strictly required, you'll probably want a needle pusher just to make things go a little bit more quickly for you. And while you do not need a variety of transfer tools, you absolutely need one in order to cast off on your knitting. The machine that I have is electronic and requires some power cords. If you see an electronic machine, it's probably a good idea to find the power cords, but this is not something that I would say is a make it or break it thing. I've had this machine for several weeks and I've only plugged it in to test it. I actually haven't started working with the electronic capabilities yet. Finally, if the seller has a manual, absolutely pick that up. That is a super intelligent thing to have. But if you don't have a manual, they're actually almost all available online for free, which is really cool. In your manual, there should be a page that looks like this that describes all of the materials that originally came with the machine. There are a variety of different accessories that you can find for these knitting machines. The biggest one that you'll most commonly see is a ribber. A ribber is a second bed of needles that's actually attached to the first bed. A ribber cannot be used independently, and it's pretty easy to mistake it for a second machine. A ribber also comes with its own carriage, and there's an attachment plate that attaches the upper carriage to the lower carriage. If you see a ribber, it's definitely worth taking, even if the person thinks that it's another machine. There are a variety of other accessories that you'd want to consider. If the seller was letting them go, I would just take everything, especially if you're thinking that you're getting a pretty good deal. You'll find a use for it. Common accessories include something called a G carriage, which is used to build up texture in your knits, color changers, transfer tools, and of course ribbers. If you're digging around in somebody's garage and you see a box that looks like it has the branding of the machine that you're buying, open it up and make sure that there's not something that you want in there. Now, I'm too new to this hobby to really be able to say how much value there is in a particular machine. But I do know that most machines in good working condition in the United States can sell for at least $200. Some machines can sell for much more. So I want to share a little bit about how I got my machines. Like I said, I didn't know what I was looking for and I took a big gamble, and if I had known some of this information, I probably would have saved myself a little bit of money. I was browsing Facebook Marketplace one night and I found a post that said yarn and knitting machines. The yarn I wasn't so interested in, but the knitting machines caught my eye, and it looked like in the post there were several. The guy who was selling them out of his grandmother's house. She had passed away a couple of years ago, and he was responsible for getting the house ready to sell. He really didn't know what he had, and he had priced it at $300. I took a very cursory look, not understanding what I was looking for, and loaded it all up into my minivan. He also had yarn, which I really wasn't very interested in, but it seemed like he was going to struggle to get rid of it, so I agreed to take it. There were 10 boxes of yarn. They were really big. They filled up my entire minivan. And when I got home and started digging through them, I had a really good thought to leave it out in my garage. Unfortunately, all of the yarn either had water, moth, or rodent damage. Really glad I didn't bring it into my house. When everything was said and done, I came home with 3 machines. I came home with 2 Brother KH940s, which is an electronic machine. One of them came out of its case working perfectly with all of its parts. The other one clearly had some water damage and unfortunately was missing both its carriage and its sinker plate. I also came back with a Singer Chunky 151. And unfortunately, I also was missing the carriage and sinker plate for that. In addition, I had a Brother Ribber that works with the standard gauge machines and a Singer Ribber that works with the 151. Neither of those had their carriages. I messaged the seller and let him know that I was interested in the carriages if he found them, and started looking online to see if I could find a carriage. I was really surprised to find that it was probably going to take me somewhere between $500 and $700 to replace all of the parts that I needed. In a last ditch effort, I sent the guy another message on Facebook, and he said he had found the pieces, but he wanted more money because he realized that he had significantly underpriced the machines. After a little bit of back and forth, I wound up returning to his house and spending an additional $300 to get the remainder of the parts. I did wind up with a bunch of extra accessories, 2 G carriages, 2 ribbers, a color changer, and many, many, many pattern books. I wound up spending $600. Overall, I think I did pretty good. If I would have known a little bit more, I think I would have been able to get all of this for less than $300. But I didn't, so I paid the price. If you're legitimately interested in purchasing a machine, I do not recommend going in blind like I did. There's a couple of different considerations that you're going to want to make before picking something out and spending several $100s on it. I have a link in the description that I think does a really good job of talking about the high-level overview of machine choice. Like picking out a sewing machine, picking up a knitting machine is actually something that you might want to think about a lot instead of just going in blind, kind of like I did. But if you get a great deal, I hope this empowers you to feel like you can go for it.